All right. So in this second video, we are going to learn about the declining balance methods. And in the declining balance methods, we are not going to assume the depreciation to be constant in the end of each year. So in the straight line method, it was assumed that the depreciation amounts are constant, annual depreciation amounts are constant. Now this time, the annual depreciation of an asset at any year K is going to be a fixed percentage R of its book value at year K minus 1. So let's just say right now your machine, your equipment is worth $100,000. And if we assume that the R value, the fixed percentage is 10%, okay, in the first year, the machine is going to depreciate over 10% of its current book value. So it is just going to depreciate by $10,000. So the book value in the end of the first year will be reduced to $90,000. And in the next year, it is also going to depreciate by 10% from these $90,000 of book value. So the second year's depreciation amount will be $9,000. So every time it is going to depreciate for 10% of its current book value, and it will go like this. So the depreciation here is a fixed percentage of the asset's current book value. It is not a fixed amount, but it's a fixed percentage of the asset's current book value. And R here, the R value, this fixed percentage that is going to be used in declining balance method, it is a decimal amount which is called the declining balance rate. And unfortunately, this declining balance rate cannot be determined freely by you. Actually, there is a interval of this declining balance rate which are acceptable by governments under laws. Therefore, you can only use this declining balance rate within an interval that is defined by the government. All right, so let's just say we have a declining balance rate of R, then the first year's depreciation amount will be R times the current book value, which is the cost basis of that machine, and the total accumulated depreciation will be also the same because this is just the first year, and the book value in the end of the first year of that equipment will be the remaining amount, which is 1 minus R times the cost basis. Now D2 is the second year's depreciation amount. The second year's depreciation amount will be calculated over the book value of that equipment in the end of the first year. So from the book value of that equipment in the end of the first year, we calculate the second year's depreciation as a R% of the current book value, and which is basically R times 1 minus R, the cost basis. Because remember, the book value in the end of the first year is calculated as the remaining value in the cost basis after the first year's depreciation. Therefore, the second year's depreciation is R times 1 minus R times B. And in the end of the second year, by the way, sorry, the accumulated depreciation amount will be equal to B times 1 minus R to the power 2. If you subtract or in other words, if you sum up D1 star and D2, you will get D2 star, which is the cost basis times 1 minus R to the power 2 in that case. And the book value will be what? The book value is the remaining amount, which is 1 minus R squared times B. So every year, as you can see, the remaining value of that equipment will be 1 minus R times the previous year's value of that machine. So every year, the remaining value will be 1 minus R% of the current book value. And it will go like this. In any year K in the useful life, the depreciation, the annual depreciation will be R times 1 minus R to the power K minus 1 times the cost basis, initial cost basis, and the accumulated depreciation amount in the end of year K will be B times 1 minus 1 minus R to the power K, and the book value in the end of year K of that machine will be 1 minus R to the power K times B. Now, according to these formulations, let us calculate the depreciation amounts and the book values according to the declining balance method. Now, again, we are going to consider the same machine in question 1. We will have the cost basis as $160,000, and there will be a useful life of that machine for 10 years. And remember, the salvage value was equal to $15,000, and due to the cost of disposition, we have calculated the net salvage value in the end of 10 years as $10,000. Now, we are going to use the declining balance depreciation schedule for this machine, and the assumed declining balance rate by this company is 15%. Again, you cannot freely select this declining balance rate by your own will. There is an interval from which you can select the declining balance rate, and that interval is defined by the government. Okay, so you cannot, for example, determine your declining balance rate as 35% or 40%. There is a limitation of the selection in declining balance rate. Now, 15% is an acceptable declining balance rate by the government, let's just say, and the first year's depreciation amount will be the 15% of $160,000, which is $24,000, and the accumulated depreciation in the end of year 1 is $24,000, and in the end of the first year, the book value of this equipment will be $136,000. So this $24,000 will be written as a cost, as a depreciation amount in the income table of income. So in the second year, the depreciation amount will be calculated as a 15% of the first year's book value in the end of the first year, and that will be 20 times $20,400. And the accumulated depreciation will be the sum of these 2-year depreciation amounts, which is $44,400, and the book value will be reduced to $115,600. In the third year, the depreciation amount for this usage year will be calculated as 15% of $115,600, which will be $17,340, and the accumulated depreciation will be $61,740. So it will go like this. So every year, basically, the book value is going to be losing 15%. It's very, so every year, according to the declining balance, every year the depreciation amount will be a fixed percentage of the current book value, so on and so forth. Now let's create the declining balance depreciation schedule. Now, just like in the previous question, we will have 10 years, and the annual depreciation is calculated as a 15% of the book value, current book value. Right now, the book value is $160,000. Its 15% is $24,000. This means in this year, this depreciation will be reduced from the book value, and in the end of the first year, the equipment's worth will be reduced to $136,000. In the second year, the depreciation amount again will be calculated as a 15% of the book value in the end of the previous year, and therefore the second year's annual depreciation will be $20,400, and the accumulated depreciation so far in the first 2 years will be $44,400. So it will go like this. As you can see, every next year's depreciation is calculated as a 15% of the previous year's book value. So in this process, you see in the end of the 10th year, our book value of the equipment is reduced to $31,499.90. However, in the end of this useful life of 10 years, we were expecting the net salvage value to be equal to $10,000 actually, but it is reduced to $31,499.90. Okay, so in this calculation, the accumulated depreciation, it does not reach to the adjusted cost basis. Now you see in the previous question, the accumulated depreciation was exactly reaching to the adjusted cost basis, which was $150,000. But in this example, the accumulated depreciation never reaches to $150,000. If it were to reach $150,000, it would stop. Okay, it can never go over this amount. Okay, get over this amount. However, in this example, it does not reach to $150,000. Therefore, there is an excess of the final book value of $21,499.90. Now you see in the end of 10 years, there's a $31,500 approximately dollars worth of book value. However, we were expecting that the net salvage value to be $10,000 in the end of year 10. Therefore, what we are going to do, we need to reduce our firm's income by this $21,499.90 as a capital loss. So this difference, because we have not reached to the adjusted cost basis, this difference, the remaining amount, the slack amount until we reach the adjusted cost basis, must be reduced from the firm's income as a capital loss upon the sale of that machine. If you can sell that machine, of course, you need to reduce this amount as a capital loss in this 10th year. All right, so let's just recalculate the depreciation amounts, again using the declining balance method. However, this time we assume that the net salvage value is $30,000. Okay, now if we assume that the net salvage value is $30,000, in that case, the declining balance method will reach to the adjusted cost basis before the 10 years of useful life is complete. Therefore, the calculations are going to be affected from that situation. Okay. Now, if we assume that we are going to get a net salvage value of $30,000 in the sale of that machine in the end of this 10 years, then the calculations are going to be affected from that. So it says, determine the declining balance depreciation schedule for this machine for declining balance rate of 20%. So this time we will assume the declining balance rate also a different rate as 20%. The first year's depreciation amount will be calculated as 20% of the cost basis, which is $32,000. The accumulated depreciation will be $32,000, and the book value in the end of the first year will be $128,000. The second 10 years depreciation, annual depreciation, will be 20% of the first year's book value, which is $25,600, and the accumulated depreciation amount will be $57,600 as the sum of the first 2 years depreciation, and the book value will be reduced to $102,400. So it will go like this in this calculation. So this, according to this schedule, in the seventh year, the annual depreciation will be calculated as 20% of the previous year's book value, which is $8,388.61, and the accumulated depreciation up to that amount will be $126,445. And the book value, the remaining book value, will be $33,554. So you see, in the end of the 7th year, there is only a small amount that is left in the book value until we reach the net salvage value, which was $30,000. Therefore, in the 8th year, when we calculate 20% of the previous year's book value, the 20% will be larger than this difference amount, the slack amount. Therefore, in the 8th year, we cannot calculate the annual depreciation as 20% of the previous year's book value. We can only write it as the slack amount, because the accumulated depreciation will never get over the adjusted cost basis, which is $130,000. Okay, so when the accumulated depreciation reaches to $130,000, we cannot write down any annual depreciation that is larger from that. Okay, because you are estimating that you will be able to sell this machine from $30,000, therefore you cannot write costs that is exceeding the adjusted cost basis, because in that case you will pay a lesser amount of tax. If you are going to be able to salvage this large amount from the sale of this machine, then in that case you need to write down an annual depreciation which is less, and it will make your annual net profit larger, of course. So in that case you will be paying larger amounts of tax. Okay, however, if the second-hand value or the net salvage value is less, then you can write down a higher annual depreciation. Okay, so the net salvage value here remains undepreciated in the years 9 and 10. You see, even if we are using this machine, because the adjusted cost basis reaches to $130,000, we cannot write any annual depreciation here. All right, so we have learned the declining balance method and also the straight line method. Also, there is a hybrid of these two methods which we can use. Okay, now in the declining balance methods, only a specified decline rate are allowed to end up with a terminal book value that is equal to the net salvage value. Now, there is, of course, let me tell you that there is, of course, a net, specific R value, specific declining balance rate, which reduces our $160,000 to exactly $30,000 in 10 years. Okay. Now, in fact, we can calculate that declining balance amount. Okay. So if the value of the book value is going to be reduced by a certain or specific declining balance rate, in that specific declining balance rate, it is possible for the book value to reach to exactly $30,000. However, we are not determining the declining balance rate with that sense, because as we have previously said, the declining balance rate is usually determined by the governments. Now, of course, in order to calculate the annual depreciation amounts, one company might not use exactly the straight line method or the declining balance method. So the company can say, I want to use the declining balance rate or the declining balance method to calculate the annual depreciation in the end of each year. However, I also want my annual depreciation amounts to be calculated such that they reduce to exactly $30,000 in the end of the 10th year, or the accumulated depreciation will exactly reach to $130,000 in the end of 10 years. So in that case, the governments are enabling the companies to use the two methods as a hybrid method. So the companies will start to calculate the depreciation amounts using the declining balance methods. However, after some point, after a year of useful life, years of useful life, then they can switch over to the straight line calculations. Okay, so it says it is permissible by the governments to switch from this method to the straight line method when the annual depreciation computed with the straight line method becomes larger than the annual depreciation computed with the declining balance method. So as you can see, the annual depreciation, because it is a fixed percentage of the current book value, it is getting smaller and smaller in each following year. Okay, so the annual depreciation getting smaller and smaller in each following year. However, if we use the straight line method. In the straight line method, the annual depreciations are going to be calculated by dividing the remaining book value, or the adjusted cost basis to the number of years of use. Okay, so it's not going to reduce. Therefore, in this method, in this hybrid method, which is the hybrid of declining balance and straight line method, we are going to make a switch over to the straight line method after a year. And in order to do that, in every year, we are exactly going to do this. Now, remember, in this formulation, the first component, r times 1 minus r to the power k minus 1 times b, it was calculating the annual depreciation in year k under the declining balance method. Now, if you go back, you will realize that the annual depreciation in any year k under the declining balance method is calculated as r times 1 minus r to the power k minus 1 times the cost basis. Okay, so this is how we calculate the depreciation in the kth year according to the declining balance method. Now, in the second component of this formulation, we are calculating the book value in the end of the previous year, in the end of year k minus 1, and we are subtracting the net salvage value from there, and this is just going to be the remaining adjusted cost basis. So this difference is called the adjusted cost basis, but because we are calculating this difference for the previous year, k minus 1, this is the remaining adjusted cost basis, and n minus k plus 1 is the remaining useful time of that machine. So we are dividing the remaining adjusted cost basis to the remaining years of use, and we are calculating a fixed amount, a constant amount, for the straight line method. So in every year, we are calculating the declining balance, the depreciation amount under the declining balance method, and we are also calculating the depreciation under the straight line method. So whichever is maximum, when we make comparison between these two values, whichever is maximum, we write that as the depreciation amount. And when in the beginning, the depreciation is calculated by the declining balance method are going to be larger. However, after a point, since the annual depreciations are going to decrease and decrease in this declining balance method, after a point, the straight line method will give you a larger amount of depreciation. And once you calculate these depreciation amounts, in the following years, until the end of the useful life, the remaining years' depreciation amounts will be equal to that value as well. So after that year, there is no need to calculate the depreciation with respect to declining balance method when the straight line method gives you a larger depreciation, annual depreciation in that year. In the remaining years, the annual depreciation will also be calculated by this formulation. Now let's do this in this question 4, and we are going to focus on the first example. Once again, the initial cost of the machine is $160,000. Therefore, the cost basis is $160,000, and the useful years for this machine is 10. And the net salvage value was calculated as $10,000 after reducing the cost of disposal of $5,000 from a $15,000 of salvage value. So this was the usual example that we have used in question 1 and also in question 2. Now, in this question, it says, calculate your yearly depreciations, annual depreciations. So it says, determine a depreciation schedule for this machine using declining balance with switch over to straight line for a 15% declining balance rate. Now, what we are going to do this? Now, right now, the book value, which is the cost basis currently, is equal to $160,000. Now, in the first year, when we want to calculate the depreciation amount, we first calculate 15% of $160,000, because this is the declining balance rate. So this is going to be your component one. So from the remaining book value, we are calculating 15% as the depreciation amount according to the declining balance rate. We are also calculating the depreciation amount with respect to the straight line method. Remember now, this is the current book value. From the current book value, we subtract the net salvage value, $10,000, which remains as a $1,500. I am sorry, $1,000. So we divide this $150,000 to 10 to calculate our constant depreciation amount for the following 10 years. Now, when we compare these two values, this one is larger, the first value is larger, therefore we are going to assume that the annual depreciation for this year is $24,000. Okay, so in the first year, the annual depreciation is calculated with respect to declining balance method. The accumulated depreciation will also be $24,000 because this is just the first year, and the book value in the end of the first year will be $136,000. Now, in the second year, again, we first calculate the annual depreciation with respect to the declining balance method by multiplying the 15% declining balance rate with $136,000, which is the book value in the end of the previous year. And that will make the depreciation under the declining balance to be $20,400. Now, how do we calculate the straight line depreciation amount? Now, the current book value is $136,000. When you subtract the next salvage value from that, you will get $126,000. And when you divide it to the remaining number of years, the remaining number of years is 9. So you divide $126,000 to 9, you would get $14,000. Now you see, again, when you compare these two depreciation amounts, the first one is larger. Therefore, in the second year as well, we are going to use the declining balance depreciation amount, and the accumulated depreciation will be $44,400, so on and so forth. So it will go like this. In every year, we are going to compare these two values, two depreciation amounts, which are calculated by declining balance method with declining balance rate of 15%, and also the straight line method. And after some point, of course, since the declining balance methods depreciation amounts are going to decrease and decrease, at some point, the second method, the straight line method, is going to return you a larger depreciation amount. Now you see, it is just going to happen somewhere here. So in the fifth year, again, in the fifth year, the depreciation amount calculated by the declining balance method is larger than the depreciation amount calculated by the straight line method. Therefore, again, we use this depreciation amount. But in the next year, the depreciation amount calculated by the declining balance method will be 15% of the current book value, which is $70,992. 15% of that value will be $10,648.93. However, when you subtract the net salvage value, $10,000, from this book value and divide it to the remaining number of useful years, which is 5, the depreciation calculated by the straight line method will be $12,198.57. Therefore, in this year, the annual depreciation will be $12,198.57, because the depreciation amount calculated by the straight line method now is larger than the depreciation amount calculated by the declining balance method. And in the following years also, no matter you calculate the depreciation amount with respect to the declining balance method, the depreciation amounts calculated with the straight line method will always remain the same. And in the following 5 years also, the annual depreciations will be the same, because once you switch over to the straight line method from the declining balance, there is no turning back. In the remaining number of years, you are always going to use that depreciation amount. And you see, if you continue like that, the accumulated depreciation will be exactly equal to $150,000. And the book value will be $10,000. Okay, so what is this method? This method is creating a depreciation schedule by using a declining balance rate. However, because it is impossible for you to reach to the net salvage value in the end of the useful year exactly, therefore, at some point, you need to switch over to the straight line method. So this method brings you the advantages of the declining balance method, because it is logical for the equipment to depreciate as a fixed percentage rather than a fixed amount. However, because you will not be able to reach to the adjusted cost basis in the accumulated depreciation, at some point you need to switch over to the straight line method, which will help you to exactly reach to the adjusted cost basis as accumulated depreciation, and the book value will be equal to exactly the net salvage value. All right, so we have one more method to learn in the calculations of the depreciation amounts. However, we are going to learn this in the next video.